Hello, students. Today, my lecture is titled The Philippines Revolution, which is also known as the People Power Revolution. It was a peaceful revolution, a non-violent revolution. Sometimes it is called democratic or electoral revolution because when the mass protest emerges from the election campaign, that's how it can be termed democratic or electoral revolution. It is also known as the color revolution, and it was after the symbols adopted by the opposition in the revolution. For example, the yellow ribbon was worn by the Philippines people during the revolution. Philippines was an American colony. The period of American colonization of the Philippines lasted for 48 years. And in this poster, we can see that the Filipino people, they are pledging for an independence. They were urging for an independent Philippines. So, a Filipino street demonstration calling for the United States to give the Philippines its independence. And this rally was in the 1930s. And as we can see from the poster, it says the Filipino people pledge immediate and true independence. In 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was established with the US approval, and Manuel Quezon was elected the country's first president. On 4th July 1946, full independence was granted to the Republic of the Philippines by the United States. This is the map of Philippines. This is the image of the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. So Ferdinand Marcos was in very close ties with the United States, and for his corruption, the Filipino or the Philippines Revolution took place. So in the election of 1965, Marcos was elected. Ferdinand Marcos was a brilliant lawyer and was credited to be a war hero. So in 1965, he was elected as the president of the Philippines. Once in power, Marcos made his wife Imelda Marcos the governor of Manila and gave high posts to his relatives. The Marcos family grew immensely rich. Imelda was infamous for her collection of more than 3,000 pairs of designer shoes. Now it is in a museum in Philippines. President Marcos was a shrewd ruler, bribed Congress to support him, controlled the media, and spent lavishly on roads, bridges, and stadiums to gain popular support. In the 1969 election, Marcos was re-elected, but his election was marked by vote buying, violence, and fraud. In 1972, Marcos declared martial law, stating that it was necessary to contain students' riots and growing communist insurgency in the countryside. In this image, we can see Imelda Marcos and Marcos. So, President Marcos and Imelda Marcos are sitting with some foreign delegates. But as I said, the main reason of the revolution in Philippines was the corruption of Marcos, who was elected initially, but he almost ruled like a dictator. This picture shows again Marcos and Imelda Marcos, and they are with the foreign delegates, and of course Imelda Marcos's dresses shows the lavish spending of Imelda Marcos, and so that was one of the factors of the revolution, particularly the corruption of the President Ferdinand Marcos. This is the image of Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., and he was becoming very popular in Philippines. So Marcos ordered the arrest of his political opponent, who was Ninoy Aquino. Aquino was sentenced to death for rebellion. So there were some disorder uprising in the country, and Marcos blamed Aquino for that, and that is how he wanted to remove his opponents. So Nino spent 8 years in prison. Then he was granted leave on medical ground. Aquino then left for the United States to have a surgery. To remain popular, Marcos redistributed land from the wealthy landowners to the poor peasants. In the late 1970s, economy began to stagnate and unemployment increased. In 1975, Marcos began to rely more on the army. Promotions were given to his preferred officers. In August 1983, when Ninoy Aquino returned to the Philippines, he was shot and killed at the moment he stepped into the Philippine soil. So the assassination of Ninoy Aquino made him a martyrdom, and it produced two trends against Marcos. It led to the unification of the opponents of the Marcos and the rifts within the military. Manila's Cardinal Jaime Sin encouraged the opposition to rally around Mrs. Aquino Ninoy. Cardinal Jaime was instrumental in gathering Mrs. Ninoy's support. Ninoy's funeral gathered hundreds and thousands of mourners. It led to anti-Marcos protests and strikes for months. So Philippines is a predominantly Catholic country, and when Cardinal Jaime Sin he took initiative to speak against Marcos' violence, Marcos's corruption, and he stood for human rights and social justice, and he did not approve of Marcos's killing of Aquino, Ninoy Aquino, when he stepped on the Philippine soil, so because Cardinal Jaime Sin was a spiritual man, and he had a lot of followers, and so his voice did have a lot of impact on the general Philippine population. This is the image of the funeral of Ninoy Aquino, and his followers, as we can see in the crowd. So it shows he was very popular in Philippines, and they are carrying his dead body for the funeral, and the flag was lowered by the crowd. So it was a very sad day for the majority of people of Philippines. This is the picture of Corazon Aquino, wife of Aquino. So Ninoy Aquino's wife became later the president of Philippines. So the immediate cause of the revolution was the February 1986 presidential election. it was a fraud election, Marcos thought that his supporters would glorify the outcome as they did on the previous elections. Longer term causes were widening and deepening, and the discontent in many sectors with the corruption and authoritarian regime of Marcos. Since mid 1970s, economic conditions had worsened and violent conflict and rebellions occurred in many parts of the country. In November 1985, when Marcos announced election, his many rivals united behind the opposition leader, Mrs. Corazon Aquino. She was the wife of Senator Ninoy Aquino. Ninoy Aquino was an opponent to Marcos's rule. As I discussed, Ninoy was assassinated in 1983 by some military officials under Marcos's order. So Ninoy had many followers. During the election campaign, support for Mrs. Aquino was huge. It appealed to the voters of wide range, emotional, moral, and rational. This slide shows how the people of Philippines very quietly and peacefully they are walking to the main avenue and they are protesting against the Marcos's unfair election very quietly and calmly. The caption of this image says an iconic photo of the People Power Revolution in the Philippines in February 1986, showing hundreds of thousands of people filling up in a avenue, and so this shows that how people were supportive of Mrs. Ninoy Aquino, Mrs. Corazon Aquino, and how peacefully the revolution was carried on. So the defining moment was the election of 1986. On the election day, Marcos and his party became desperate to win the election. So on the election day, on 7th February 1986, votes were tallied, were added, and opposition voters were intimidated, and many other fraudulent things happened. People were aware of the abuses. Many of the nation's Catholic leaders publicly condemned the election abuses and demanded that Marcos should step aside. Foreign media was broadcasting these developments overseas, but Marcos defied these calls to step down. Hundreds of thousands of people held vigils at polling stations outside the National Assembly building and throughout the nation. On 15th February 1986, the KBL controlled, the Marcos's parties controlled National Assembly. They declared that Marcos and the vice presidential candidate won the election, which was a false declaration, which actually Marcos tried to win through electoral fraudulent. On 16th February 1986, 2 million people gathered at the Luneta Park in central Manila to hear Mrs. Aquino declare firmly that she won and not Marcos. Mrs. Aquino urged people to join a civil disobedience campaign called Victory of the People against Marcos's government. She also urged the companies and the newspapers to support it. So the split within the military became another crucial factor leading to Marcos's demise. More military forces joined the rebel soldiers against Marcos. 80% of the army defected against Marcos. Marcos sent a tank to crush the revolt, but the soldiers were well organized and remained peaceful and non-violent. In the front line, Christian nuns kneeled with rosaries in front of the tank. Pregnant women and girls offered food and water to the soldiers. U.S. government and other international bodies urged Marcos to avoid bloodshed. on 25th February 1986, the day Marcos was scheduled to sworn in as president again, Marcos lost control of 80% of the military and much of the media. He did not have any international support. Marcos then agreed to go to the United States. He took the United States suggestion, and he and his entourage were helicoptered to an American military base in central Luzon in the evening of the 25th February 1986. From there, he was flown to Hawaii, where he lived the remaining few years of his life. So it's this revolution is also called a color revolution. People wore yellow colors. They had yellow posters, placards, ribbons. So that is why it is called the Yellow Revolution. And so as Ninoy Mrs. Ninoy Aquino, or Corazon Aquino, who won the election, became the president of Philippines, and she called for a civil disobedience rally, and this is how people gathered, and very quietly they protested against the unjust and unfair Marcos's election, and that's how this picture shows the successful yellow or the color revolution. So it's more precisely the word is color revolution. So basically Marcos was he lost because a wide range of opponents to Marcos united behind one candidate, and that was Mrs. Corazon Aquino, who had tremendous popular support. People across the country were resolved to make the 1986 election an authentic reflection of voters' sentiment and preferences. Their determination was manifested in a range of activities aimed at making the process as clean and as honest as possible, blowing the whistle when violations occurred, and opposing transgressions even after authorities had declared that Marcos was the winner. Then there was this military split in a manner that prevented the coup d'etat. To save themselves, the potential coup maker needed the support of the people, which is something that had never been anticipated. So there was this split in the military, and many military officials went against Marcos. The media kept spotlights on the situation and helped the people communicate with one another. Media attention probably contributed a fifth factor. The confrontation was virtually nonviolent. Marcos and the military officers who stayed with him refrained from using force against the people. The demonstrators carried no weapons, and the rebel troops decided to rely on the people rather than on their armaments. Finally, citizens who supported Marcos were not sufficiently committed to aid him anymore. There were few demonstrations of public support for him between the election day and the day he fled the country, but the majority of the people, they stood for Mrs. Corazon Aquino, and as Mrs. Corazon Aquino appealed to the people for a peaceful civil disobedience, and that was done by the people of Philippines, and that is how it is called the people people's revolution. And so it is again it is called the color revolution or democratic or electoral revolution, and or it is called the people's power revolution. Thank you.